In an interview in 1999, His Holiness the Dalai Lama spoke about the modern world's fascination with Buddhism. He said, "Since the mid-60s, many people in the West have become interested in Buddhism. Initially, their interest was a kind of rebellion against their own religious establishment and discontent with the way of life in their own societies. They were looking for help and turned to the Eastern religions. At that time, interest in Buddhism was more to do with prevailing fashion than anything else. But things have changed. I would say that over the past 20 years, interest in Eastern philosophies, and especially in Buddhism, has become more sincere and genuine. Two and a half thousand years ago, Buddha Shakyamuni was born in India and taught what we now know as Buddhism. According to Sogyal Rinpoche, the Buddha's appearance at that time is compared in the teachings to the rising of the sun. In the same way that the sun dispels darkness in the world, the appearance of the Buddha dispels the darkness that lies in the hearts of all beings. Once these teachings had appeared in the world, there developed a tradition that generation after generation of people followed and that spread throughout the whole of Asia. Roughly 1,000 years ago, Buddhism came to Tibet. Surrounded by an almost impenetrable barrier of snow mountains, Tibet offered an environment in which this spiritual tradition could be practiced and realized by thousands and thousands of people. We think of our tradition of Buddhism as a gift we have to offer the world. And all that we, the teachers of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, would ask is that you accept our offering, enjoy it, make use of it, and benefit from it. Ironically, it wasn't until 1959, when China invaded Tibet and tens of thousands of Tibetans were forced into exile, that this unique form of Buddhism became available to modern people through the teachings of masters like Sogyal Rinpoche, who is amongst the last generation of teachers to have been born in Tibet.
I was invited to hear the Dalai Lama speak in London, and I went along. Afterwards, I was with my daughter. They said, come and meet him. And I said, no, but the real Buddhists here should meet him. You know, I'm just kind of interested, but I'm not a proper Buddhist. And they asked me 6 times, so in the end I thought... So I got in the line, and when I met him, I just thought, well, I'm not going to say something banal. I'm not going to say, where did you get your sandals? Or how is this incarnation going? You know, and I met his eyes, and when we just laughed. We laughed and laughed and laughed. And then I said, thank you very much. This is my daughter. And about a minute later, Sogyal Rinpoche came up to me and introduced himself. And he said, I'm known as the Laughing Lama because I use so much humor in my teaching.
I was born in Tibet, and I was 6 months old when I entered the monastery of my master Jamyang Khyentse Chokyi Lodre in the province of Kham. In Tibet we have a unique tradition of finding the reincarnations of great masters who've passed away. They are chosen young and given a special education to train them to become the teachers of the future. I was given the name Sogyal, even though it was only later that my master recognized me as the incarnation of Terton Sogyal, a renowned mystic who was one of his own teachers and a master of the 13th Dalai Lama.
I had an extraordinary life. I think if only you could be in me and experience all that I experienced, I think you might be a little bit amazed, because I had lived in this extraordinary environment in Tibet. It was when Tibet was at its peak, with this extraordinary Jamyang Khyentse, when all the great masters, so, just now it's just like a heaven I lived in.
My family, Lakatsang, had been among the wealthiest in Tibet. Since the 14th century, it had been famous as one of the most important benefactors of Buddhism, supporting the teaching of Buddha and helping the great masters with their work.
In Tibet, normally they would refer to my family as, Tehor Adu Lakatsang. That's the full name. And they would often call us Tembe Jinda. Tembe Jinda means you are the benefactor of the Buddha Dhamma.
After we escaped from Tibet, we became refugees. This is where we made home, where my master Jamyang Khyentse was invited by Dandi, the late king of Sikkim. And so it really became our home. As a result, I developed a really very strong, both emotional and spiritual connection. As maybe you know, that Sikkim is a very sacred land, blessed by Padmasambhava, who was the one who brought Buddhism to Tibet. This great master who is really our inspiration in all the Himalayan regions, like Bhutan, Sikkim, Nepal, you see, very much. So that Sikkim is a place that he blessed and is said to be a sacred, a hidden land. He even said that it will be a place which will give refuge for practitioners. And in some ways that came to be so. When we escaped from Tibet, this was where many of the great masters like Karmapa, then my master Jamyang Khyentse, and many of the great masters and the leaders of the whole different lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, took the Sikkim as their home.
My master Jamyang Khyentse was tall for a Tibetan, and he always seemed to stand a good head above others in a crowd. He had silver hair, cut very short, and kind eyes that glowed with humor. His ears were long, like those of the Buddha. But what you noticed most about him was his presence. His glance and bearing told you that he was a wise and holy man. He had a rich, deep enchanting voice, and when he taught, his head would tilt slightly backward, and the teaching would flow from him in a stream of eloquence and poetry.
He was, or he is still, regarded in Tibet as the greatest master of his time. He was the authority, the inspiration. Really, he was really the spiritual leader that brought together all the lineages. Extraordinary master, extraordinary being. And that I was extremely fortunate. That's been my good karma, to have been born and he brought up in his environment like his own son. Really, and so he became my ground, my inspiration. Whatever little I know, I owe to him entirely. He was the embodiment of what Tibetan Buddhism is. He was really an extraordinary human being of tremendous love and compassion, wisdom. Some of all the greatest masters were nurtured and inspired and brought and recognized by him. He was amazing. He was amazing. He was an artist. He was a... You say it, he is. This is what is called Sogyal Rinpoche. It's really the kind of the cathedral, and it's the Sogyal Rinpoche that connected with the royal family. This is the connect with the royal chapel. It's also, this particular hall is where most important ceremonies take place, such as the enthronement of the king, took place here. Since after Tibet, perhaps this is the most authentic Tibetan Buddhist temple shrine, an example that we can find. All the masters say this is of exquisite, a masterpiece, this place. In this very hall, when my master Jamyang Khyentse passed away, his body was enshrined here. In the presence of this, many of the great masters were here. We practiced for many, many months. In fact, in the presence of his body, before it was being cremated, I continued my education. Many of the teachings that my master began to give, which were not completed, were then completed by some of his disciples. And so I have really a lot of memories.
After we reached Sikkim, Rinpoche used to wear always the robes, and Jamyang Khyentse didn't want us to go to school, particularly Rinpoche, because he didn't see much, maybe at that time, Western education was not important. The Eastern education was, Tibetan education, Lama education was important. I remember at the Palace Monastery, I had to study with Rinpoche to keep him company, and some others were there also to keep company. Rinpoche was a very intelligent student, but he was also a very stubborn one.
I was a naughty child. None of my tutors were able to discipline me. Whenever they tried to beat me, I would run to my master and climb up behind him, where no one would dare to go. Crouching there, I felt proud and pleased with myself. He would just laugh. Then one day, without my knowledge, my tutor pleaded with him, explaining that for my own benefit this could not go on. The next time I fled to hide, my tutor came into the room, did 3 prostrations to my master, and dragged me out. I remember thinking, as I was hauled out of the room, how strange it was that he didn't seem to be afraid of my master.
In some ways that there was this very deep relationship that I kind of naturally grew into, that I recognized maybe even from the past also. I don't remember so much words or specific things, but the atmosphere of the love, the atmosphere, it's like there was kind of no question that, he was the ground of my life. He was my, my father, my spiritual father, my mother, everything he was.
Usually I slept next to my master on a small bed at the foot of his own. One sound I'll never forget is the clicking of the beads of his mala, his Buddhist rosary, as he whispered his prayers. When I went to sleep, he'd be there, sitting and practicing. And when I awoke in the morning, he would already be awake and sitting and practicing again, overflowing with blessing and power.
남긴 다른 다이에 semjena mambe 신도 구성을 줄데 밤만저 semje 말림바 참진 돈메 살라친 바라쇼.
I think in ancient times, and in the West too, there is that relationship between disciple and master that existed. For example, Christ and his apostles, for example. And also if you look into the great philosophers, for example, their disciples. So there is that exists. In some ways that really, I think you can say it is the highest form of human relationship and the highest form of love. What you call it, a divine love. A devotion, or that kind of that relationship that you build on a most deeper level.
I was very afraid at first, actually, of the relationship with the teacher, because I did not want to lose my own autonomy, and also because I was afraid of what other people would think. But tentatively, I just followed the teachings of Rinpoche and the courses that were in the city where I was in Australia. And then after about 6 months, actually, something really melted in me or dissolved, that it was like the first blossoming of devotion. And at that time, I had a very strong feeling to become a nun. 4 years later, then actually I did become a nun.
In many ways, you see, the master is the one who brings out the best of you that you have not realized. He brings out. So he is you in the highest and the deepest sense. And he brings the highest and most profound love.
Sometimes he'll be like my father, like my mother, like my boss, like my friend, like my enemy, because he pushes my buttons, But I know always his heart and his motivation is so pure and so profoundly attuned to my path and to my potential being realized, that I just completely trust him, and so have offered my life to him and do what I can to service him.
It's almost like that the love, the profound love that he gives you brings the love out of you, and it helps you to love yourself in the best possible way. Thereby then you can love others. And also not only love, but love also compassion and wisdom. It's amazing, really. And so I don't think sometimes people don't really understand very much. Let's look at on ordinary level. In human, I think we all really very much, how would you say, cherish human relationship, friendship, deep love. What does it do? It really brings out. It really helps us to, you see, make us realize that really Master is one who brings out the best of you, and also sometimes shows the worst of you. He mirrors it and helps you to purify your negative aspects, and then shows you what your true nature is. This is a very sacred place, particularly for me. This is where my master, my beloved master, Jamyang Khyentse Lodri, resided. You see, when he came out from Tibet, and he actually stayed here in Sikkim at the invitation of then the king of Sikkim. This is where he resided, and this is where he passed away. And here at the back he's enshrined his relics in the form of what is called stupa, and has many sacred things blessed by many great masters. Like whenever he's on the Dalai Lama, when he comes to Sikkim, just the first place he comes, makes obeisance, makes homage, pays respect, and many great disciples of his master always comes here. My mother was particularly responsible for feeling that I should get this Western or modern education to know the ways of the world, and so I went to Catholic school.
We managed to get place for him in St. Augustine's School in Kalimpong. It's a Catholic school. There were a lot of foreign French fathers. That was a good school then. So I went to reach Rinpoche to school, and they asked for his birthday. And I didn't know, so I gave some date. So Rinpoche always says that I'm the one who gave him his birthday.
I've never endeavored to learn English and get a modern education, but in the process, what's interesting, I met many other people, many peoples of different, how do you say, from Bhutan's, of course, from Sikkim, from Nepal, different, from India, so many, from Thailand, different. So it's like a really coming from a monastery to meeting kind of, different people, different children, different, really, it was a really learning process.
So I remember we went to school in 1960, but Rinpoche, because of his, background in Tibetan Buddhism, he finished school in about 6 years. That is senior Kimich, while I took the usual 12 years, So that way, again, he was very, exceptionally intelligent. And the strange part is that he would don on the, what you call, school uniform before going to school. But after coming back, he would change into his monk's dress. And so that, transition, it was very interesting because a lot of, his friends would be, marvel at that. He was just now in layman's dress and all, while he's in his, Rinpoche's dress. So he used to be called Lamala in school, I remember. And he had shorter hair than most other students. But he lived a normal, I think, school life.
I think one of the culture shock was that really we had to go to church every Sunday. very regularly, and sitting, kneeling there and saying all these prayers was a bit of a culture shock for me, particularly then because I didn't understand. It was a different religion. Of course, then later I went to England, to Cambridge, to study comparative religions, and but the thing is, really, for me, the real understanding of Christianity and other religions not grew from studying comparative religion. It was more my own spiritual development. As I continued my own education with my other disciples, my masters. As I began to develop, there was no cultural shock. There was not so much a difference. Now, for example, now I'm just completely at home in the church. I have tremendous reverence to Christ, to Virgin Mary, to all the saints.
I remember him as somebody who was always monk-like, lama-like. My mother told me very, sort of secretly that when she was in an advanced stage of pregnancy and she was traveling on horseback with her maidservants, there was some mantra uttered from her stomach, from her womb. And she was very surprised because it was the mantra of Guru Rinpoche. You see, that mantra was uttered. She heard that very clearly, so she told me this a couple of times.
And we believe, for example, in our tradition, in our religion, or in our spiritual tradition, that when a very holy man or woman or enlightened being passes away, in order to really, they would not just retire into enlightenment, they would want to continue to come back. Maybe an aspect of them would go into the celestial realms of the Buddhas, but then they would emanate the aspect of themselves to serve for the elevation of the suffering of beings. So as a result, that we have this tradition of the incarnations, which started now, I think, about 16, 17 generations, really, and in His Holiness now this one is the 14th.
In Tibet, a tradition of recognizing such incarnations or tukus began in the 13th century and continues to the present day. When a realized master dies, he may leave precise indications of where he will be reborn. One of his closest disciples or spiritual friends may then have a vision or dream foretelling his imminent rebirth.
Or often the child, him or herself, will start actually speaking at a tender age, start saying, maybe he may be born in a certain province, like Bavaria, but will start speaking the dialect of another region, where his previous incarnation was. It's amazing. And so the child would then say many special indications of this extraordinary qualities, and then this would be then this would be then referred to masters. That not every teacher would really recognize incarnation. There need to be teachers of a certain understanding, certain caliber realization, who had that insight, the foresight to be able to see, and many would be consulted, and then accordingly that kind of that verification is made.
What continues in a tulku? Is the tulku exactly the same person as the figure he reincarnates? He both is and he isn't. His motivation and dedication to help all beings is the same, but he is not actually the same person. What continues from life to life is a blessing, what a Christian would call grace. This transmission of a blessing and grace is exactly tuned and appropriate to each succeeding age, and the incarnation appears in a way potentially best suited to the karma of the people of his time, to be able most completely to help them.
I remember vividly when His Holiness Dalai Lama made his first ever visit to the West. We landed in Rome, Italy. And I still remember because at the airport, there were two people there to receive His Holiness. One was the then His Holiness representative in Europe, Mr. Pala. Rinpoche, he was much younger, and also, in those days he was quite thin. Sogyal Rinpoche has a very special and unique relation with His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. And maybe that relation was definitely started much earlier, during the time of the 13th and Rinpoche's predecessor, Lerab Lingpa. Because the fact that Sogyal Rinpoche had a fairly important role in organizing the first ever visit by His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the West, as if that he went there ahead of time, kind of the vanguard, or make the preparation. He was one of those Tibetan Buddhist teachers who went to the West, but had always stood very closely with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I can say is the most highest speech manifestation of the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition to the West, next to His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
I was watching a teaching of his on tape in London about 4 weeks ago. He was there, but sometimes they present his teachings on tape. And I noticed how extraordinarily calm and quiet I felt when the tape finished. And I was reminded what somebody said once when they went to India to watch some of the great gurus speaking, and people would walk for 2 days from their villages to hear. And yet, what this guy, it was Arthur Koestler, had noticed was that when they sat listening, a lot of the time they didn't really seem to be listening very much. They would be playing with the children, or they might be eating, and suddenly Koestler realized they'd heard the words before, many times. But what he noticed, that every now and again, one of the people out there in the crowd would just sit up and look at the guru, and it was as though he was drinking him in. So what I think Sogyal Rinpoche and the great teachers do is there's something about them that you pick up as you listen to them that is so much more than the words.
The entire teaching of Buddha can be summed up into to tame this mind of ours, to transform this mind of ours. For if we conquer our mind, then our perception and our experience will be transformed. So the main thing about, as Dalai Lama always says, Buddhism is not about rituals, not about ceremonies, not about even yoga and mantras, even though they may be part of Buddhism. But fundamentally Buddhism is about transforming the mind.
It's interesting that the word for Buddhist in Tibetan is Nangpa. It means insider, someone who seeks the truth not outside, but within the nature of mind. All the teachings and training in Buddhism are aimed at that one single point, to look into the nature of the mind, and so free us from the fear of death and help us realize the truth of life.
The fundamental Buddhist belief is that do not harm others, For example, Buddha said,
commit not a single unwholesome action. That means as much as possible abandon all the unwholesome, negative and harmful actions which are cause of suffering for yourself and others. That's what Buddhists believe. At the same time also, because that's the cause of suffering. On the same time, you must cultivate wealth of virtue, which is very much, how do you say, engage in positive actions of the body, speech and mind, which are the cause of happiness. That's what Buddhists believe, because very much we believe in the causality of law of cause and effect. Whatever actions we do, we get the repercussion. Very much so. Therefore, the ethical aspect of it, that when we harm others, it harms you.
In erster Linie geht es darum, ein guter Mensch zu sein. Und das ist vollkommen unabhängig davon, welches Etikett ich habe. Ich kann ein guter Atheist sein und ein guter Mensch. Ich kann ein Buddhist sein, ein guter Mensch. Ich kann ein Christ sein, ein guter Mensch und was auch immer. Und diese Qualitäten in mir zu entwickeln, da habe ich Hilfe gekriegt. Das war mir vorher nicht so klar. Ich habe mich mehr als gegeben genommen, mit einem guten Potenzial. Ich war durchaus überzeugt, dass ich einiges an Qualitäten habe, aber dass es zu entwickeln gibt, dass ich überhaupt wie in einem Spiegel sehe, was ist hilfreich für mich und andere und was ist nicht hilfreich für mich und andere. Da hat mir der Buddhismus geholfen.
If you say what Buddhist believes in is that the Buddha nature, or rather put it this way, in Christianity is very much you believe in God as the creator. But in Buddhism, God is not seen as the concept of God is not spoken of in Buddhism. But Buddhism, that more the nature of God, is something that in all of us, in a sense. If you were to relate to the Christianity, even in Christianity, we are all children of God. So if you're children of God, there must be godliness and goodness in ourselves. So Buddhism really developed that goodness in us. So that whole basis starts with the goodness in us, the godliness. We call it the Buddha nature. That's why what's amazing is that the emphasis is more on the goodness, that our true nature is pure, like the sky. Even the clouds come. If you go beyond the clouds, the sky is unchanging. The goodness is never stained, that fundamental goodness that in all of us, the unchanging goodness. That is what Buddhists believe. I remember one of my master, called Rinpoche, used to say, "Rest in natural great peace, this exhausted mind, beaten helplessly by karma and neurotic thoughts, like the relentless fury of the pounding waves in the infinite ocean of samsara. Rest in natural great peace." Padin Sogyal Rinpoche dak ninkar pemi den karin chimbi gone Jesus kuzon to ngurno dan.
The purpose of meditation is to awaken in us the sky-like nature of mind and to introduce us to that which we really are, our unchanging pure awareness, which underlies the whole of life and death. In the stillness and silence of meditation, we glimpse and return to that deep inner nature that we have so long ago lost sight of amid the busyness and distraction of our minds. Isn't it extraordinary that our minds cannot stay still for longer than a few moments without grasping after distraction? They are so restless and preoccupied that sometimes I think that living in a city in the modern world, we are already like the tormented beings in the intermediate state after death, where the consciousness is said to be agonizingly restless. We are fragmented into so many different aspects. We don't know who we really are, or what aspects of ourselves we should identify with or believe in. So many contradictory voices, dictates, and feelings fight for control over our inner lives that we find ourselves scattered everywhere, in all directions, leaving nobody at home. Meditation, then, is bringing the mind home.
My mind was very busy. I didn't realize that while I was living in Sydney in my working life, I didn't know my mind was busy. I thought it was fine, you know. But now I see that actually when I calm down, when I meditate, when I learn the basic practices, then I can see things more clearly, I can make decisions better, I can act more effectively, and hopefully benefit others more.
So very much first in the Buddhist meditation is to really to rest, to settle, just as water, if you don't stir it. There's a very famous saying which comes from the great master of the past. When I heard this about 35 years ago, it had an extraordinary impact on me. That in Tibetan is very beautiful. It says, Chumanyuk natang semmachunade, which means just as water, if you don't stir it, will become clear. In the same manner, nature of our mind is such that if you do not manipulate, fabricate, because trouble with us is we manipulate, we fabricate our minds through too much thinking. As many people say, many authorities on mental health say, the root cause of all our mental suffering is too much thinking. And if you think too much, it stinks. Through the practice of meditation, the cloud-like thoughts and emotions dissolve and clear, revealing the sky-like nature of mind. Out of the sky-like nature of mind shines forth one's true nature like the sun. The sun has wonderful qualities. It has tremendous warmth, which is like the love, which is love and compassion. It has tremendous light, brilliance, which is wisdom. So what it reveals, you see, through this calm abiding, through this peace, meditation of peace, just as water, if you don't stir it, will become clear, mind left unaltered, will find its true peace, and then find the contentment, the inner happiness that comes from within. And when mind finds that peace in the state of calm abiding, that out of that one's true nature, one's own wisdom and compassion will manifest. Thereby, not only it purify us, benefit ourselves, we can then benefit and serve others.
I spent a lot of time in America, and I notice more strongly in America than anywhere an enormous resistance to the idea that you're going to die. My wife was talking to a man in his 70s just 2 weeks ago, and she actually said to him, "Do you ever think about death?" And he said, "Absolutely not." I think that people should be put in lunatic asylums for thinking like that. And it also makes us much more grasping, because if we think we aren't going to die, then we want as many possessions as possible. But if we know perfectly well we're going to die, and we're not going to be able to take them with us, that gives us a perspective. And I think a lot of the American striving and the fact that culturally greed You remember Gordon Gekko in Wall Street, greed is good. That kind of thinking comes from the fact that there's a psychopathic denial of death. And with the Buddhists, not only do they talk so openly and freely about death, but they talk about suffering. This is the reality. Suffering. It's there all the time. I mean, I find I don't go through a day without seeing or hearing about someone who has had a terribly difficult experience to deal with. And the Buddhists just take it straight on.
When I first came to the West, I was shocked by the contrast between the attitudes to death I had been brought up with and those I now found. For all its technological achievements, modern Western society has no real understanding of death, or what happens in death, or after death. I learned that people today are taught to deny death, and taught that it means nothing but annihilation and loss. That means that most of the world lives either in denial of death or in terror of it. Even talking about death is considered morbid, and many people believe that simply mentioning death is to risk wishing it upon ourselves. Others look on death with a naive, thoughtless cheerfulness, thinking that for some unknown reason death will work out all right for them, and that it is nothing to worry about. When I think of them, I'm reminded of what one Tibetan master says. People often make the mistake of being frivolous about death and think, oh well, death happens to everybody. It's not a big deal. It's natural. I'll be fine. That's a nice theory, until one is dying.
Mein Vater hat Krebs bekommen und hat dann Bauchspeicheldrüsenkrebs, und der wird meistens zu spät entdeckt, und dann war er 1,5 Jahre krank und meine Mutter hat ihn zu Hause gepflegt. Und das war meine erste Begegnung mit dem Tod, und danach war für mich klar, ich weiß nichts über Tod, in meiner Religion gibt's keine Hilfe für mich, also ich bin katholisch erzogen, nicht wirklich richtig katholisch, aber bin schon in die Kirche gegangen mit meiner Mutter und so, aber auf jeden Fall in dem Augenblick war klar, ich habe eigentlich gar keine Ahnung, was Tod wirklich ist.
I think we do not look at life and death as a whole. As such, we become very attached to life and reject and deny death. As a result, death becomes our ultimate fear, the last thing that we want to look at. That's why I always tell people, if you're worried about dying, don't worry, I promise you, you will all die successfully. We all die. I mean, we will all die. We will all die successfully, meaning that we will all die. That will happen.
Und dann habe ich mich auf die Suche gemacht und habe spirituelle Sterbebegleitungskurse gemacht, weil ich einfach auch gesehen habe, wie hilflos ich war, meinem Vater wirklich zu helfen, weil ich selber so emotional wurde und ja, weil ich einfach selber wirklich so keine Ahnung hatte, wie man damit umgeht. Und die Frau, die diese Kurse gegeben hat in der Heilpraktikerschule, die hat das tibetische Buch von Leben und vom Sterben von Sogyal Rinpoche benutzt. Da gibt es ein ganzes Kapitel über Sterbebegleitung und es hat mir sehr geholfen.
Death is like a mirror in which the true meaning of life is reflected. That's why in all the spiritual traditions, like even in Christianity, among the contemplative monks, there's a saying, memento mori, remember dying. Because if you remember dying, then you might remember what life is. Because death is not just death. Death gives meaning. In some ways, really, reflecting on death and reflecting on God are very much similar. That's why in the spiritual traditions, that reflecting on death, on impermanence, is really, that cleanses the soul.
Vor knapp einem Jahr ist mein Sohn gestorben und da diese Lehren zu haben, die das tragen, ja, die das in eine größere Perspektive setzen, die Liebe zu ihm ausweiten auf andere, die sie hinausgehen lassen über den Moment des Todes. das hab ich in diesen Lehren gefunden. Und das hat getragen, das hat mir geholfen. Und ich glaube, es war gut, dass ich schon vorher davon was gehört habe und nicht in der aktuellen Situation. Und von daher gesehen, definitiv habe ich da Hilfe gekriegt.
I'm in fact not going to die. I'm just going to go on living. I decided last night that my existence is so important. And also I then have more time to acquire more stuff, you know? And then my wife will die and I can marry somebody really young.
You know DVD? Now new thing is BVD. Say that? BVD. B is bodhicitta. V is view of shunyata if possible. We cannot give the teachings straight away. The teachings have to be also adapted in the way, translated. So therefore, I really feel my life has been a translation. I travel with my masters, like for example, with the Dalai Lama, I had the honor to really actually serve His Holiness on his first visit to the West, which was quite significant. And then later with my own master, Sogyal Rinpoche, I think with Sogyal Rinpoche, and when people would come to them and would bring all their problems, because people did not bring spiritual questions to them, they become psychological, emotional, relationship problems, and the master would just laugh and daily. It was so much a learning process, really. And then it's really kind of really how to translate. So in fact, my book, Tibetan Book of Living Dying, came as a result of this experience that I had and all the questions that people brought up, and really that there was really, so it was like a really research. It was really research and translation. So, and I continually learn how to better translate the teachings, how to better understand, how to better communicate. And I think also not only communicate, but how better help people to experience it. That's extraordinary about the teaching of Buddha. It's not based upon just theories. There's a whole experiential lineage of knowledge, of experience that's been handed down from person to generation to generation. So it's like even the king is dead, but long live the king. Even though the master may die, the students have inherited that understanding. And that's the strength of, in many ways, Buddhism as a whole, and Tibetan Buddhism in particular. How I realize much more how this ancient wisdom is so practical. The tradition of the Buddhist trainings have helped me how to not lose authenticity. But West has taught to me how to make it practical. And so therefore I can bring this kind of practical insights or the ways of the West, and then bring the teachings in a much more vibrant way. I remember someone coming to me when I had written the book on one of my book tours in America. This person came to me, said that really thanked me for writing the book. This person said, I don't know how you did it, but the book loved me completely. So this love that teachings bring you, it became the love in you. And that love then you in turn radiate, and through that you benefit beings. And that's, I think, when you're able to feel that love of the nature of your mind, and that share that wisdom, compassion, and benefit. It's like when I'm able to help others, communicate that, and help others. That's the time when I'm most happy.
Wilt u naar aanleiding van deze uitzending reageren of een gratis programmagids bestellen? Bezoek dan onze website boeddhistischeomroep.nl. DVD's van onze programma's kunt u bestellen op 010 411 3977.